Okay, Indira, sorry for waiting for your turn so long. You could have at least 15 minutes more sleep.
No, it's perfectly fine. I wake up.
Thank you so much.
And I'm actually happy to if there is any other burning question from the students or from the other
We will
participants.
keep it for the end of the discussion.
All right, then you're really good. I'm trained as an oral historian.
Good.
I'm not a lawyer for a very good reason. I'm very emotional. I get very passionate. I use my hands a lot to my expressions. You can read my face. And that really works when I work with survivors, right? Because you do want to have somebody who is informed. We might have gone through any traumatic event by ourselves, and if we find someone who is trying just to, cut us short and be on their side, then we feel as victims or people who have survived an event or mass atrocity that we are not being understood. I think that there is also another wonderful documentary about sexual violence in war that was done by Abigail Disney, and it's of course the granddaughter of the famous Disney. I don't know, have you seen it? And it really covers Rzepa, and it covers. So I have chosen Calling the Ghost because I worked on that film, and it was in a way, as someone who was overwhelmed with what was going on. I came from Belgrade in 1994 to United States, and I had a research fellowship at a New School University, right? Which is another story in itself, to really focus on the international intervention on the topic of sexual violence and how that became a security issue for the Security Council. As we all know, I think we all agree, Security Council is here, and the issues that the Security Council deal are, according to Chapter 7 of the UN chapter, it really deals only with matters of war and peace. So how did the women's body become an issue of security? That was my topic. Here I was in your shoes, coming out of, at that time, Belgrade. So I know Sonia very well. Sonia knows me as, with my with my maiden name, which became my middle name now in the United States. So she might not remember me that way. But I worked with Red Cross, right? I was employed by International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent. And, sure enough, I have interviewed a lot of people, just like Nena and Jeffrey would say, who were coming by buses to the refugee centers, mostly Serbians, but they were people of all ethnicities. So I became this very overwhelmed sort of person who couldn't really hold the conversation on this topic with the cocktail glass, right? So the film, Calling the Ghost, was for me really first thing that I did in the United States that had to deal with how do we inform public, particularly young people, on these mass atrocities while they're waiting for justice. Because frankly, none of the survivors who I interviewed or I worked with have ever been happy with what was happening in The Hague. And for those of you in the region, you might have your own thoughts, and I'm happy to elaborate on that. I really want to keep it on the courses, like how do we engage these young people in a conversation about mass atrocities, about ethnic cleansing or genocide, on the issues that, and how is then that relevant to their lives? Is this making sense? Anybody has any questions so far? No? So that was the film. You can see it, you don't have to see it, but I feel what was important in that part is also it spoke to me as a feminist because it really focused on individual life of women. And it kind of fit into, if you are involved in reading documents in that era, you would see that, for instance, the Human Rights Watch, which is a huge watchdog, and Amnesty International on the respect of the human rights globally, that they adopted at that time, we hear the term humanitarian intervention, but that time they adopted so-called feminist perspective that each life matters, right? That each life, in this case, that women's rights are human rights. So that it became really important then to focus on individual stories, or individual, if you want to call them victims, or if you want to call them survivors. That's a topic on my dissertation, but that's different aspect of that story. Whatever, however, as lawyers, you probably deal with victims, but there is a totally other aspect for researchers. And I want to focus on the research aspect of it, because now we all in 2020, as Sir Jeffrey has noted, has noted that a lot of documents are redacted. We don't see them still. We don't know what's on a piece of paper. As we heard from Professor Trump, we could have certain suspicion of who this mole is when we are faced with a documentary like this. But what's that we can do about it as a researchers, as a people who are really concerned about how to address not only the issue of justice or truth, or whose truth is that, because as we all know, we remember only the things that we want to remember. The truth is socially constructed, memories particularly. Social memories are shared within the groups. So certain groups of survivors who have gone through, let's say, kind of experience of working on a film have a shared narrative that some other people who might have not had that experience, or who have testified with the hate, they have a certain way of understanding. They have a certain language that they would use. Back to this film. So it's 1995. Mandy Jacobson is a, an African, I'm sorry, she's a South African journalist who has been based in New York. She's totally overwhelmed with the amount of material that they filmed. There are 2 survivors that they have, of course, worked with many more. They took the very unusual route to get survivors to speak, which is yet another topic. And again, journalists or documentary filmmakers have much more freedom that I would have as a researcher. And that's something that I really need to clarify. If you are doing any type of academic research, every country has had, because of the practices to re-traumatize victims when they're telling their stories and their narratives, there is an institutional review board in the United States, for instance. It was only based on a report since 1970s. Before 1970s, people were much freer to ask anything that they wanted. Is this making sense? So as a researchers, there are also a lot of, and if I would not be able to publish my work if I break that, if I ask something that's not approved by internal research board. Do you understand also that there are restrictions? However, in my research, for instance, if I were to analyze, and if I were asked to code the interview between the policymakers, by the way, when we interview policymakers, because they are talking about public documents that might or might not be available, I don't need to have an approval by internal review board. I only need to get an approval if I'm speaking with victims or survivors. It's the term that I use. So if you allow me, I would prefer to use that term. So there are so many, one would say, barriers. Some are reasonable, and they all make sense when we are doing. But then the question still is, how do we do this to present material, not to overwhelm the audience? Whether we are talking about younger audience or we are talking about audience like university students who can take certain amount of distance or truth. So that still remains the question. The biggest freedom does lie in people who are documentary filmmakers, and what has been a blessing in some ways, and you might turn it the other way. I'm an optimist, as you can see. I have always been that way in my life. Is that this was the war that was publicized. You still have images. And these were the images that could be used to communicate a message with younger people, to educate. Whether we are talking about traditional forms, and in traditional forms like getting approved to present certain type of historical truth, then again, it's a disciplinary issue, really. They would say, oh, the oral historians have so much material that we can't really see objectively what that is, right? So there will be this, is anyone trained as a historian? If you were trained in you're with Amina, and where did you study history, Amina? You can share it.
I'm studying European Studies at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, but I am not a real historian, but I've studied history lots of times.
She is studying for her degree, so Amina, you're
Yes.
fine. She's my student, Indira.
Right. Well, we are all historians when we talk about events that have happened in the past, but there is this course of narrative historians, people who focus on what's being said, rather than social historians, what has happened in the past. And in most traditional fields of history studies, they're very conventional. I'm trained as a political scientist first, because I was running away from history so much, but it always followed me, right? I studied in Belgrade. That's where I studied. Then I got my BA. I studied at the Faculty of Political Science, but my topic was diplomatic history, and that's totally different story. But it puts me in the midst of this interesting intersection, whether I study what's the narrative of people who are writing history books, as we would say, because it's the major understanding is who writes history books. Anybody wants to guess? Anyone? Participants as well. Sonia, who writes history? Well, go piše udžbenike u našem.
The winners. The winners write history.
So who is going to deal with the survivor and their overwhelming account? It's not objective. It's not distant, because that's what the historians, even our best friends, would say. You have to distance yourself when you study a subject that have happened in the past. A lawyer would say, you have to be objective. You have to
Indira, I'm going to interrupt you just for a minute, because I think that the audience is in a different position. Some, for example, Francesca, has viewed your film in full, as indeed have I. Has anybody else seen Indira's film in full? Because I'm going to ask them all to look at it. It's a very important document, I believe, to look at. And in a way, Indira, I don't mean to be difficult, but we're more interested in what's on the film than in how people become filmmakers, I think, because the film is capable of showing a huge number of things. And so what I'm going to intervene and then come back to you if you don't mind. Francesca, what as I got out of your film, Indira, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 really big issues and I'd like you to deal with them. But let me see, Francesca, what issues, if any, did you get out of this film on a first viewing?
Well, on the first viewing, I was very shocked that, I mean, I knew that the camp existed, but I didn't know to what extent what had happened there. And I was shocked that I didn't know. After, I don't know, I did the last 12 weeks, I did courses about the Yugoslav wars, and still I didn't know. And especially going also to the German school system for parts of my education, I'm aware of what happened in the Second World War, and it's not any different what happened in Omarsk. So when seeing this, realizing this, that actually the stories I read about other concentration camps are exactly the same, this kind of made me realize to what extent we're still ignorant to what happened in Bosnia during the war.
Well, I completely agree with that. Now, if nobody else has seen the film, and I do ask you to look at it, I'll raise a couple of other issues. Indira makes the point through her film, doesn't she, Francesca, that there are different impediments, there are different blocks on the passage of information. First, there's the fact that people have to survive and not get thrown onto the fire. People were burnt alive, according to this film. So you've got to survive. When you survive, the women have to overcome all sorts of personal difficulties and cultural difficulties in revealing the truth. And then, Francesca, what did you think about the son of the woman who, if you remember that little bit, the son of the woman who decided to go public? Tell us what he said and explain how that's another impediment to the truth, one of many.
Yeah, I mean, he said, he showed how difficult it is in a way to be the son of a mother who has gone through all of this. And yeah, it's not what you would probably expect if you're an outsider, but you don't think about it from this perspective of a different generation, which kind of also lives with this burden of knowing what happened to your parents and then going public with it.
Thank you, that's absolutely right. And the women victims didn't tell each other when they came back from being raped what had happened to them. They couldn't tell their husbands, and if they went public, they would run the risk of humiliating their sons. And so when all of us, I think, involved in these trials have paid insufficient attention to the huge damage caused by rape as a weapon of war. Before I come back to Indira, I know you haven't seen the film, but any of the others of you, have you thought about or given any, or read about or seen anything about rape as a weapon of war yet?
I did some work previously about rape and sexual violence in conflict, and I actually saw I watched something, it's a short little documentary that was like a Newsnight program on last night about the use of rape and rape camps in the Bosnian War. And I think there was this one woman, and she said that I think it comes back to the point about how the violence never really ends, and that she she was going about her daily life in the past few years, and then she would still see people on the street that she knew who had been involved in those camps and in raping and assaulting women, and even some of those some men who perhaps have been found guilty and served their time, and they're now out as free men. And I think that's also the sort of added level of violence. The fact is that there are people who are in Bosnia and obviously many of the war zones that are walking around with this trauma and having to see the perpetrators sometimes daily, and perhaps even if they're then venerated into positions of power and as politicians or whatever. I think that's also, that's quite shocking to me, it's being perpetuated still to this day.
Thank you very much. Anybody else who's done any work on, read anything about, or seen anything about rape as a crime of war. Francesca, one other part, I don't know if it impressed you, but I'm going to use you as a sounding board, and I hope you don't mind that. What did you think of the letter that was sent back to the woman from the man? And just explain that, if you feel you can, and what that told you about it.
Yes, well, one of the women, she received a letter from one of the main perpetrators who had assaulted her during her stay in, like, while she was interned. And he wrote, first of all, he denied everything that she had said, also publicly, explaining that women only came regularly, but they left home again, like not saying that they were interned over a long period. And then explaining why he would never rape her. First he said she was older or she was not attractive, or just really denigrating, adding to the fact that he already raped her in the past, now saying that he would never do it and further insulting her. And I think, yeah, this shows to what extreme these perpetrators are willing to go.
Yes, I mean, I thought that was a very a powerful point. I mean, he ended up by saying, I wouldn't even rest my bicycle against her. And those of us in England, and I'll just alert you to this, because this is a much more general problem, will know that there is a far-right activist in England who has refused to withdraw his observation critical of a woman MP, saying he would not even rape her. Do you remember that, those of you in England? And this is, it's broader than just sex as a weapon of war. It has to do with the unstoppable denigration of women by men. Indira, if you'd be good enough, please, and just in one sentence each, what would you have hoped people to take away? Not what you wanted, having made the film, what would you have hoped people would have taken away from your film as one sentence lessons, however many of them there might be?
If you don't mind, I would like to give Holly just a word before she forgets her thought. And I know.
Okay, thank you. I was just going to make a point because I just remembered that I went to Burma a couple of years ago, and then I remember reading reports from the UN afterwards that they have found that sex is used as or rape, sexual assault is used as a weapon there, and that's not just for women and girls, that's also used on men and boys. So there's kind of a different level of humiliation for them there in terms of masculinity. That's what I was going to say. But I don't know that much more about it.
I hadn't detected you pointing out.
Right.
Somebody else, Indira, what would you want us to, would you want people to take away from your film?
Well, for this particular film, I think the main purpose, it does really puts the focus on the survivorhood, but the history is not something that only happens in the past. That as a researcher, I can say, and that the issues that are relevant to humans as we are far beyond, oh, this happened in these backwards Balkans, and it's never going to happen to us. And it's never going to be relevant to our lives. And that was the most important point of how do we get to that place that we are not overwhelming every single person that's dealing with this massive amount of documents, whether they're from policymakers, massive amounts of interviews, whether they are from survivors. And when we interviewed survivors, and that's what Mandy and Carmen had at that time, they were at a place of people who were trying to help, but they had these massive numbers of interviews, but they didn't really understand how to craft a message or how to craft a point for educational purposes or for the purposes that are relevant to each individual lives. And that's really a most important part that one can have as a filmmaker. I also had worked as a journalist before and a filmmaker of some sort.
There's quite an interesting passage in your film, Indira, that deals with something that we've touched on this morning, and that is the willful obscuring of information from the public by this morning's first film was really by government. Mm-hmm. But your film shows how when Ed Vulliamy went to the camp with other journalists and was well-intentioned, how very easy it was for the camp guards to deprive them of sufficient knowledge to ask even relevant questions. It wasn't their fault. They did their best for another 7 months or something. Mm-hmm. And those of us who I've never been at the sharp end of a gun, mm-hmm. Or threatened by people in uniform, but it is jolly easy to stop the truth coming out. And I think your film makes that very clear. Anything else, Indira, that you want to say? And Nena, I think we're probably at wrap-up time.
Right. So
no, I would like Indira to finish her narrative, which she started, and I think it's a very important addition to us and saying that there is something that is a legal narrative now that uses also the witness testimonials and everything, but it is under completely different rules. So I'm very curious to Indira to finish why and how oral history by researchers contributes to complement the conventional historical methodology, because Yugoslav wars created a huge amount of oral history from all sorts of sides, including actually filmmaking as an oral history testimonial as well. So Indira, please finish your academic expose, and then we will have some time for discussion.
I'm glad we're having this, because this is really the main point for a researcher who is trained in oral history, is a dialogical framework. It's really not putting an emphasis of an outsider or an insider, because when I finally ended up going to do my dissertation study and to interview the survivors who I have known as an activist, as a scholar as well, and who I have followed, including to transcribe the interviews, because one aspect of the interviewing people who are informed what the legal aspect or what the legal or how to challenge legal boundaries, if you will, is that both of these women whose narratives you might see in this film were trained as lawyers. They believed in the justice system, if you will, whether it was in Bosnia, where they came from, Prijedor, or it's the International Court of Justice. They were parts of this whole group of people who were involved with so-called ARIA formula meeting, where the survivors or experts, academics and researchers had an avenue to talk to the members of the Security Council. You know, people who know very well how can you talk to the members of Security Council who are making certain decisions, right? When you can be on that level that they will hear you. So ARIA formula meeting was invented in 1995. So there are all of these bits that we can serve. But the main point for the academic inquiry, for use of oral history, of course, not to overwhelm the audience, in a way. I think that films, particularly documentary films like the one that you have all seen, have been instrumentalized to inform general public, to educate general public in a way that could be crafted, but also can bring certain aspects. So when I met the filmmakers, Mandy Jacobson, a South African, and Carmen Jelencic, who is a Croatian American, I also had an agenda, and I could inform them how to craft that message for American public. As a feminist, I knew that American feminists and that movement will be interested to see how can we move the law, right, to the place of recognizing women's rights as human rights. So that's one agenda. So if you want to say it's very important, it's a dialogical framework, and the fact that whether it's objective or subjective, it doesn't necessarily matter what really truthfully happened in some ways, because the survivors would sometimes tell us, he took me. If I were to translate these words in English, if you came like to Ed Vuliami, they wouldn't say he raped me. They would say he took me. And what does that mean? How can you rely on that testimony? Or how can you, as a researcher, when I'm informed of the nuances of the language, whether when I spoke in Albanian as a native speaker, or when I spoke in Bosnian or Montenegrin, Serbo-Croatian, whatever the language is called these days, but I speak nuances to the point that people, that I know the context, that they would use certain wording. My participant in my study, an Albanian woman in Đakovica, she just stood up. In the court, what would you say? You can't use that. To me, as an informed researcher, that means that she's paying a respect to her Serbian neighbor that she was talking about. Because the Serbian neighbor told her to get lost, to just disappear that night, that she had to take her family out. They didn't give her any explanation. And she just did it. The only thing that she would describe it, maybe later, but in the context of the wording, which was approved for me to, when I talked to the survivors, was that she stood up. And of course, then in my, so it's a need, of course, to be trained, not only in the local nuances of the language, but also to be trained in the technique of asking these questions. So that's the dialogical framework is for the oral history. I just want, if I have 30 seconds, maybe I have.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to really, so the importance, and I'm glad, I really appreciate your time. I'm glad that people look at the documentary filmmaking as a tool, because the Grbavica film was also used by Jasmila Žbanić, was used locally in Bosnia. I know that some Bosniaks are here, and I'm sure they have seen it. It's in a similar setting, except that it was done mostly based on the narratives of survivors who were helped at that time by Medica Zenica. And it really talks about the dynamics of when we are trying to do good, when we are trying to help or intervene, how that has its own complexities. She used, Jasmila Žbanić used the real women's stories and narratives, and she followed them when she presented that film. The film had a critical importance for the survivors to move the members of the parliament of Bosnian Federation, not Republika Srpska, right? That there is still a huge chaos, to move the legislation where they can actually get so-called pensions. Historically, it's incredibly important that the women who are survivors of sexual violence can claim, and with the first case in Kosovo, it's just happened last year, that they would be able to claim the monthly pension, that they will have the status of the victims of war.
Thank you so much, Indira. You touched again the topic that we introduced with Hasan Ukanovic, to say how for survivors sometimes is much more important to put in motion the mechanism for restorative justice that would restore their social economic position than to wait endlessly for a criminal justice and a retributive justice to produce any sort of outcome. And I think this story about rapes as being now recognized as crimes against humanity, that there is a state intervention to provide possibility for pension for these women. And yet, from what I know, and I never researched it, many women even for the sake of pension, would never make this step and put in writing the status that they have been raped. So it is a quite fascinating thing, but I think because we were over the time yesterday, I would like to actually finish today on time. So is there any questions for Indira now? We will watch the film and then we will have some other probably discussion and comments about it. But at the point now, do you understand what oral history adds up to the records produced in conventional history writing and even the courts, and how important it is what Indira was doing, or people like Indira are doing? It's a flourishing research now. Oral historians are becoming important.
And Francesca, how strongly would you advise your colleagues to devote an hour and 7 minutes, I think it is, or 13 minutes to the film?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend people watching it, because it's what, like you said, Indira, it's really from the perspective of the survivors of these individual women. So it's very personal and it really gets the message across, I think.
And for my part, I was able to run 4 cases, or 3 was it, at the Yugoslav tribunal, where rape as a crime or didn't feature very much in detail. We had so much else to deal with that we didn't brush it under the carpet, but we just didn't focus on it. And that meant it's only things like Indira's film, although we called 1 or 2 victims of rape who spoke of it, but it's only really things like Indira's film that give you a full picture of one of the many villainies we face. And we face it not just in conflict, but we face it in English society, where we have people of the kind I spoke about the other day. Thank you, Indira.
Is it possible to contact you, Indira, after watching the movie, the film? If there's questions or...
I'm going to send to on the chat is my personal email.
And you can Emina, you can use also Jeffrey Nice Foundation chat, and Indira, you can join as well, so that others can follow as well. I will show again the Bestars chat.
I personally had problems putting in questions at the forum.
Okay, Bestar, can you take care of it? Emina has problems with putting questions on the chat. You have to sign up with your email, obviously.
Maybe one question as well. I watched the movie, but the quality was really bad. I don't know if that's because I watched it online.
It's one of the reasons is because the movie is really under. It's another way of how they. So it's.
Or is it purpose?
The purpose of the way. It's owned by Women Make Movies. It's a company that then doesn't allow us to put it fully online in the way. So I'm sorry for that. And the copy you have is just made, as you would say, natively, as we will say, it's not a real one, but it's available there. It's the only one that's available. Mandy has moved from that topic. It was too overwhelming, and she's in South Africa. Carmen is married to a diplomat, so she can't really talk anymore. So it becomes this issue of how then
distribute it. We have exactly the same problem with this award-winning film, The Snow. It is a featured movie by this fabulous movie maker, Aida Begic, and I had to contact her because her film is impossible to buy online. She has a French distributor. So these fabulous movies, which are not Hollywood, not commercial produced movies, are impossible to buy. You know, I'm trying to buy, she's going to give us as a courtesy her own private codes for Vimeo, because she understands. She even on behalf of us contacted a French distributor and they couldn't help her. Can you imagine? They're not selling her film. Her own distributor. I mean, it's a huge, huge problem. This is why we are going to send you all this video database as well, because you would be surprised how much trouble we have to get you some of these movies. it's I get it through usually through movie makers and not through distributors. It's amazing.
But although I agree with Francesca, the film is very hard in one sense, I actually decided to make that a form of advantage, because the fact that it was hard to view, physically quite difficult sometimes to see the text, reinforced the fact that truth is hidden, and that you had to work your way through a slightly imperfect film to ensure you got the truth. So don't be put off.
And there are
Okay.
two thoughts that I would like for you to have, and really two issues to think: that the truth is hard to find or contested, but it's also socially constructed. And that's meaning there is this group of people who have experienced it, and they have their ways of telling their story. And how is that accessible to general public? And the reliance of non-state actors very often, who have no vested interest, or it might be professional interest, to really, like journalists like Ed Vulliamy, or like filmmakers, or like the other people who want to at least to bring a light and to focus on the aspects of the truth that are sometimes hidden. And the other one, of course, is complicity. Are we complicit as people who now have heard or were told to also be able to share what has been our learning in this process? Is my learning then to tell my child never to study history, because I got a fit just the other day, he's supposed to be going to college, and I'm like, ah! Or is it, how do we then are able to access it? So I would say in American context, particularly in the light of the last movie, I know, Nena, you want me 30 seconds.
No, don't worry. Don't pay attention to me. You are a guest. And
I have shared on the chat the 2 links. There is one organization that's called Facing History. They go, and they're quite big, particularly in New York. They particularly came as an outcome, if you want, as an unanticipated outcome of Holocaust or genocide. And then we didn't go into the naming, how important it is to name something ethnic cleansing versus genocide, or Holocaust as particular one. That's when I see you next year. I hope we will be able to explore those issues. But what I'm trying to say is that those actors are then responsible to bring youth, using the visuals, of course, just as the generationally, we all are, in a way that is not, that's possible to create, and also allowing people who want to study more then to ask questions and follow up. And then you find all kinds of other issues that are very much unresolved as researchers. So it's not something that you do and you put in folder and it's finished. For a researcher, that's a process. And that's the biggest challenge. For journalists, the challenge is to fix it, to fix a problem, to have the airstrike or not. That's probably for policymakers. For researchers, the process for an oral historian, it's a dialogical process. It's not something that's finished. I cannot say that I'm going to stop communicating with my participants because they're not going to be involved in my research anymore. They're part of my life and theirs. I'm part of their lives as well.
thank you so much, Indira. If you have, so please, any last comments, any messages to Indira, any questions? If no, Indira, I hope you will be able to join us in some later stage of your morning, maybe even tomorrow, when we are going to talk about a judicial approach to genocide and what we've seen here. We are going to deal with the documentary in a more structured way than we did today. And I thank you all for being with us. And I hope to see you at 10 o'clock tomorrow when Andrew Kelly, the former prosecutor at ICTY Cambodia and a few other places, I guess, is going to tell you how actually the investigation into Srebrenica crimes at the ICTY started. Indira, thank you so much, and please do join us and look at the website as well, because you will see many other video materials as well, which can help you in your education endeavors in New York. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you tomorrow at 10 o'clock sharp. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.